Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Minnick, and welcome to the Introduction to React. Uh, my name is Chris Minnick again. I'm an author and trainer. I specialize in web and mobile web development. I've written several books, including JavaScript for Dummies, HTML and CSS for Dummies, JavaScript for Kids, and around 10 others. I have about 20 years of experience as a full stack web developer, meaning that I do both server side as well as client side development. And I've been a trainer for over 10 years. I currently train in React, Node, Advanced JavaScript, and mobile web development. And there's my Twitter handle there, Chris Minnick. Wintellect is known for consulting and training. We have instructor-led training as well as on-demand training through Wintellect Now. Wintellect is a Microsoft Gold certified partner and the winner of the IAMCP 2018 Worldwide Partner Award. Wintellect's founders are industry influencers who have written over 30 books between themselves. And for taking this webinar, you can get several discounts and special offers here, including a 10% discount on any public virtual MOC course. You can get a 10% discount on Microsoft certification roles training, $99 certification exam voucher. And I'll repeat this at the end, and you'll be getting an email with this information as well at the end of the webinar. So now let's get into it. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. This is really the most basic definition of what React is. In this webinar, I plan to tell you more about how to write React, what some of the best practices are for writing React, and hopefully I'll explain some of the key concepts and ideas behind React and tell you where React can be useful. React was created by Facebook in around 2011, and in reaction to concerns that its previous license, open source license, could lead to patent litigation, React is now licensed under the MIT license, and it is the most popular JavaScript user interface library today. What React does is it makes composable web components, renders them, and updates them. So this is really key. React is just concerned with the front end, with the view part of web application. I'm going to repeat that over and over because it's a really important point. Where React works is pretty much anywhere. React itself just makes these components that you can put together to make a view. The rendering is handled by a separate package. So React DOM or React Native, there's a package for rendering to HTML5 canvas. But React itself just handles making these components. Where you render depends on the renderer. Most commonly, and what I'm going to be using in this demonstration and webinar, is React DOM, which renders to the server and or to the browser. React is a thin API and has the benefit of being able to play well with other libraries and frameworks. For example, you can use Node, Express, Mongo in React, or Angular plus React, or Meteor plus React, or ASP.NET in React. You don't need to convert to React in whole, which is one of the benefits of using it. It's very flexible. You can just start using React in pieces inside of your web application. And then as you get more comfortable with it, or as you get more people trained in React, you can just start to expand what you're using it for. React is, so once in a while I'm going to launch these polls and you can just kind of test your knowledge of what I'm telling you in these polls. And so there's the first one. React is not a framework. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't have a data layer. It doesn't have the ability to interact with a backend database in any way, and doesn't have AJAX capabilities. If you want to do these things, you can hook in another library very easily. And it's very common to see React used as the view layer and instead of, let's say, Angular directives, for example, or the templating system in Meteor. You can use React for complex single-page applications. You can use it as a substitute for views in a traditional MVC framework. It can be used to generate static HTML on the server, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about renderers a little bit later on. And it can be used to create native mobile apps even. It's extremely flexible because of this decoupling of components from how the components are rendered. So I'm going to throw up another one of these polls just for fun here. There we go. And I'm going to get into some coding. So, let's see. Who uses React? A lot of people. There are so many different companies using React right now. It's extremely popular. This is my short list of people using React. Some of these companies are using it for mobile apps. Some of them are using it for their web apps. Some of them are using it for both mobile and web. And so the correct answer to that question there is that React uses the MIT license. And I'll just close that one now. So I'm going to get into some coding, but first I want to show you a little bit about my development environment, how I personally work with React. And you can just follow along or watch the video later to see what is needed to get started with doing some React development. I use WebStorm by JetBrains. This is a really popular web IDE, and this is what it looks like. You can use any IDE or code editor you're comfortable with. Other really popular choices are Microsoft Visual Studio Code, or Brackets from Adobe, or Atom from GitHub. So in WebStorm, you can open up a terminal window, which you're going to do right here by clicking there in the lower left. And I'm on a Mac here. If you're using Windows, then you'll be using Windows Command or some other terminal emulator. Git Bash is a good one. PowerShell, something like that. And you're going to need to have a recent version of Node installed to do any work with React. You can check the version you have installed by doing node-v. I have version 10.13. If you don't have Node or you don't have a recent version, you can go to Node.js and you can download a version just by clicking. I recommend the LTS version. And so I have a recent enough version, and I'm going to use a package called Create React App, which is going to make a boilerplate app for us. This just avoids a lot of the setup involved in working with React. And the way I'm going to install Create React App and create my first project is by using npx. And npx will go and download all the packages we need from the web, and then it's going to run the program. So this is Create React App, and then you specify what you want to call your app. And I'm going to call it just my first app. And this is going to take a little while, but you'll see that it will start downloading and you'll get a progress bar very shortly. There we are. And while it's doing that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Create React App and exactly what it's doing and what the benefits are of Create React App. Create React App creates a React app with no build configuration. And if you've done the build configuration for doing React development, you know that it can be pretty hairy. There are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of tools that are frequently updated. There are a lot of configuration files that are required to set up all the different tools that you need in order to do React development. Create React App simplifies all of that, and the setup that I just showed you is really all that's necessary. But of course, it does sacrifice some flexibility for this simplicity. So if you really understand the tools, you have more power to be able to configure things and make your development environment just how you want it to be. If you just want to get in there, write some code, then Create React App is a perfect way to go. What Create React App is going to do and what it's doing as we speak is one second. It's installing a lot of local packages. It's installing React, it's installing React DOM, development server, it's installing Webpack, Babel, Jest. Webpack is a module bundler, Babel is a compiler for JavaScript, Jest is our testing framework, and then it's going to create a boilerplate project. So again, the benefit of Create React App is zero configuration. If you do need to configure something more than what the default Create React App configuration is, then you can always eject your app. This unbundles everything, gives you access to all the config files, but once you eject, you can't stuff it back in to Create React App, except by starting a new project and then just copying over your files. So let's see how we're doing here. Okay, cool. So it is done building, and you'll see now if I expand my tree here in the project, I have a lot of files. We have the node modules, which contains all of the different modules that Create React App installed, and you'll see that there are quite a few. We have a public directory containing our index.html, and this is the file that we load in the browser that includes all the JavaScript, and then we have our source. And to run this, we'll just go into the project directory and then type in npm start. And this is going to spin up the development server and then launch a browser, and it's going to open a sample application at localhost port 3000 by default. And there we are. So this is the sample application that's automatically created for you when you run Create React App and build a new project. So now let's look a little bit at the source code here of this app. The index.html file here, when everything is bundled together, it's going to include index.js. And index.js just has some imports. These are ES6 imports, and then it has a call to React DOM.render. And this is what I referred to earlier. This is the renderer. And so the renderer is going to render a component, which is referenced using this XML element here, and the component is called app. And it's going to render it into this spot. referenced by document.getElement by ID root. And so that's in our HTML file right here. So our component's going to be rendered written into there. App here is included from app, so that's this app.js file. And so this is our first React component. And if we look at the structure of this, you'll see that we have class app, which extends component, and component is react.component imported from the React library. And then we have a render method, and the render method returns something. In React, every component needs to have a render method. And the job of this render method is just to return some piece of the user interface. So in this case, this is what the piece of the user interface that we're rendering looks like. And this looks a little strange because it looks like we're mixing HTML with our JavaScript, but that is not the case. What we're doing here in actuality is we're using a language called JSX, which is a syntax extension to JavaScript. All of this HTML looking stuff actually gets compiled into JavaScript before you deploy to the server or to the web browser or wherever your app is going to run. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what JSX does, but first I'm going to show you that it's very easy just to make changes here. Whoop. And then it recompiles on the fly and hot reloads in the browser. So now we have the change happening right there. In that example there, app.js is called our root component. What that means is every other component in our application builds into or is a subcomponent of the app component. And to show you what example of what components kind of look like in the real world, we can go to the Node.js site. And this is a pretty simple user interface. It consists, if we were to build this in React, we might create one root component for the entire site, and then we'd have a header component for the section up here, body component, and then a footer component. And then inside the header component, we might have a nav component and a logo component. The nav component is made up of reusable and repeated nav item components here, perhaps. And then in the body component here, we have two different button components. And then we have some text here in the footer. So components, React is just building a tree of components that all build up into one single root component. And that's what gets rendered by the renderer. And the renderer, in the case of this application or any application on the web, is going to be React DOM. React components are self-contained and reusable pieces of the user interface. And each React app has at least one component called the root component. And the root component has subcomponents. All components are instances of the React.component class. And each component renders a React element, and React elements can be composed using JSX. So this is an example here of a very, very simple React component. So you'll see that it has the class name, which is my component. It extends React.component, and then it has a render method, which returns something. And there in the return statement, we have it's rendering hello inside of an H1. So that H1 and the hello there inside of the return, that's JSX. This resembles HTML or XML, but it compiles to JavaScript. And to show you an example of how that works, I'm going to go to the web. We use a tool called Babel, or some pronounce it Babel. to actually compile this JSX into straight JavaScript code, which is then run by your browser. And there's a try it out button here where we can write some code, and I'm going to just create a constant called element and set that equal to our h1 hello world. And you can see over here on the right that it compiles to var element equals react.create element. And so you can absolutely write React using react.create element methods, but there's no real good reason to, because all of your React is going to be compiled. All of your JSX will be compiled exactly to these react.create element methods. And you can see the benefit of using JSX once you start doing things that are a little more complex, because you get into situations where you have nested create element statements. And if I were to do this and put in maybe an input with a type equal to text, and then finish that off. And so here's a little bit more complex react.create element statement that has some attributes, at least one attribute here, the input with a type of text, and it's nested. This is what JSX gets compiled to, but it's just so much easier to actually just write the JSX code than to be writing all these create element methods. And so that's JSX. A few other important things about JSX that I'll demonstrate here inside of our demo application is that if you want to use JavaScript inside of JSX, you can use curly braces. As in this example, we're importing a logo, this logo SVG, and then we're rendering it right here into the image. You use curly braces, and you can put any JavaScript statement inside of those curly braces. If you want to pass data from one component to another, you use attributes, and this passes data into a component. And I'll show you that in a moment. And then right here, you'll notice that we have this attribute called class name. This is a result of the fact that JSX is not actually HTML, it's JavaScript. And so this is normally we would use in HTML, we'd use the class attribute to specify how this should be styled. In React, we use class name because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Another example here where you need to change the attribute name is the for attribute, because for is a reserved word, and you change that to HTML for. So let's see. So next, moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to design components, and then show you an example of building some components. So let's just first talk a little bit about component design. There's this idea of first that's common, a common pattern for how to think about React components. And they should be focused, meaning they only do one thing. Independent, meaning they don't depend on other components. Reusable, meaning you can use the same component multiple times in your application. Small, and testable. It's a good way to remember how to design React components. If you sometimes get to a React component where you're thinking, well, this is growing kind of complex, then you should think about making it smaller by decomposing it into smaller subcomponents. And stick to the principle with React components of single responsibility, meaning that it only has one reason to change. So let's look at our root component here in this application. We have a lot of things going on here. We have these elements that look like HTML elements. In fact, these are HTML equivalent elements. These are built into React. They just render some piece of HTML, and note that they all start with a lowercase letter. You can also create custom elements in React, which is the biggest benefit of using React. And I'm going to make a custom one here. I'll put it underneath the header, and we'll call it footer. And note that custom components by convention start with an uppercase letter. So this one's going to be called footer. And in order to make this component, we need to import it. So I'm going to import footer from /footer.js. The JS here is optional. That's perfectly valid there too. And then I'll create my footer file. Call that footer.js. And it starts out with the import. So we're going to import React from React. Whoops. And then class footer extends React.component. And then, as I mentioned, every component has a render method. And the render method has a return value. And in this case, we're just going to return something. We'll make it a paragraph that just says, "Thanks for watching." And there we go. And then very importantly, this is a JavaScript module, so we need to export it. And we'll export it as a default module called footer. In React, typically we always have just one module per file. And so we're always using default exports, and each component is in its own file. And so now this footer component here is being included into the app component here, and then it's being used inside of the app component right down here. So if I did everything right, this will rebuild. I can go back to the browser, and then down here at the bottom, you can see the "Thanks for watching" text. Now you can pass data from one React component to another using attributes. And so these attributes inside of the JSX become properties of the props object inside of the component. So to demonstrate that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have a in-app, I'm going to pass something in called footer message. And we'll say this is something like intro to React. And so this message will be passed down with this name to the footer component. And then in the footer component, I can make use of that by accessing this .props.footer message. Whoops. So there we have it. And now I can see that that text has been passed down into the footer component, and it's included right down here at the bottom. These are props. Props are immutable data passed from the parent to the child. So let's talk a little bit about props. Here is an example of using a prop. We have a component here called hello, and I'm passing in a value Chris, and then in that component hello, you can use that by accessing name in the this.props object. And then React also has another type of data that's called state. And state is the object in your application that represents the part of your application that can change. This is the really important thing. You have to look at your application and determine what changes. Is there user input? Is there something that comes from a database? Is there some piece of dynamic data? That is the state, and React will re-render the application based on changes to the state. So it's important to figure out in advance what is the state of your application, or what should be stored in the state object. And questions to ask to determine that are, first, is it passed from the parent via props? Then it's probably not state. So if you're passing it like this, then inside of this child, this .props.name is obviously not state. Does it change over time? That might be state. And can you compute it based on any other state or props in your application? Then it's probably not state. Remember that props are passed to the child within the render method of the parent. They're immutable, and they may actually offer better performance. React can optimize for them better than for state, so you want to keep the amount of state in your application to a minimum. State is mutable data where the state of the parent becomes the prop of the child. And so now I'm going to just do a little more work in my application. Oops. And we're going to implement some state, and I'm going to show you how initial state is created, how it's passed down, and then how it's mutated in an application. So here's our root component again. And this is just simple JavaScript. Really, React is a very lightweight API, as I mentioned. It has this component, and it has this render method for rendering things. Everything else is just JavaScript. If you know JavaScript, then React is going to be pretty easy for you. And especially if you know modern JavaScript. So in modern JavaScript, you can create these classes. And classes can have optionally a constructor. If you have a constructor in your class, you need to call super to get the props from the parent. And then you can set the state in a component by saying this.state equals, and then you create an object. And I'm going to create a simple counter application. And so I'm going to have a count property with an initial value of 0. So now we have our state object. And I can access this inside of my application by, let's see, I'm going to just chop all this out of here. And then I'll put in a new component called counter. And it's going to have count passed down from the state. And so now I need to include counter, so we'll import counter. And then I'll create that counter file. And I'm going to import React from React, and then class counter extends React.component render method will return some piece of UI, and let's see, how about it just returns what the current count is, and then we're going to make a button for incrementing the count. So I'll just make a div and then an h2 inside of there, where I'm going to render this .props.count. So notice here that we have the this.props.count, which is what the this.state.count becomes when it's passed down using an attribute. So there is our thing right now. Let's also make a button, and the button will just render let's be increment me. And so there's our button. And then, of course, it's very important to do the default export. And then this should render, and we have this button, and we have this current value of the count displaying right there. But nothing's happening when we click this because we haven't wired up the action yet. So that's going to require a little bit more explanation about how React handles data, how state is updated in a React component. Updating components happens when React render is called, and React render is called during React set state. The set state method is the only way that you should ever mutate the state object. So here, again, we set our initial state, and we know that React uses one-way data flow. So all the data in an application travels from parent to child all the way down the tree. We don't have two-way data binding, such as Angular and other frameworks where events inside of child components affect parent components or can send data to parent components. We just have one-way data flow. So the result of this is that if you want to change data in the application, you need to change it in the parent component. So if you want to change something down here in the lower level, you need to trigger an event there, which changes something in the upper level, and then the data trickles back down. So I'll show you how that works in practice. First thing to do is to write a function that will mutate the state in the way that you want it to. So right here below the constructor, I'm going to create another method, and I'm going to call this handle click. And the job of handle click is going to be to call this.setState, and we're going to set the count to this.state.count +1. So we're just incrementing the counter and then setting a new value for the count property. And so that's our function that we want to call when the button's clicked. But you'll see the button doesn't actually exist in this component. We need to pass this function down to a subcomponent in order to work. Before we do that, though, we need to bind this function to this component. So inside the constructor, we're going to actually create a new function with the same name. And this is one of the places where React can be kind of tricky and it gets a little bit confusing. But if you know that what we're doing here is we're saying, let's make a new function by binding handle click to this current object. Now we have this new handle click function with the same name, but it's bound to app. Now we can pass handle click down to the counter component by saying something like handle click equals this.handle click. And so we're actually just passing down the function bound to the app to the counter component. And then in counter, we can actually just set an on-click event. And the way you do that is by saying right here, on-click equals this dot props dot handle click. And so now when you click on the button, it's going to call the function this.props.handleClick, which is bound to the app component, which will set the state to the current value of this.state.count plus 1. So now if I go back to the browser, click this, and clicking the button increments the value. You can see in the React development tools right here that we have the state has a property of count, and every time I click this button, count increments. You can also see here's the component, and it has all of the subcomponents. It has counter here with a value being passed down, and it increments every time I press the button. So that's a really simple interactive React application demonstrating props and state and multiple components. Let's talk a little bit more about how React renders and what makes React so performant. Let's go with the poll here. Okay. So there are multiple different React renderers depending on where you want your components to render. There's React DOM, which we've been using, which supports client and server-side rendering of React components. There's React Native, which actually renders native iOS or Android applications. React Blessed can be used for creating terminal applications. GL React for creating WebGL out of React components. And React Canvas, which can be used for creating HTML5 canvas graphics using React. React DOM, though, is the one that we're concerned with. It's a React package for working with the HTML DOM. And you only use this once in your application, and it has some methods for finding the nodes, for rendering, and for unmounting. But to really understand what React DOM is doing, you need to really understand the HTML DOM. And the HTML DOM is the JavaScript API for HTML documents. It represents your all the different elements in your HTML document as a tree structure, and gives you methods and properties for manipulating and addressing these different parts of your application. Everything inside of a DOM tree is a node. So your elements, your document itself, all the text and comments, the document type, these are all nodes, and you can access them, manipulate them, move them around. Traditionally, in JavaScript, the way to do this has been to use methods like getElementById to set properties like innerHTML. And let's see, I'll take some questions at the end here, but yeah, I'll take a few of these. Oops. Okay. Oh, I say we're having a question here. Oh, when the polls are present, the slides are not visible. Sorry about that. I was not aware. Is it better now? Okay. So I'll back up a little bit. The DOM. It's a JavaScript API for HTML documents. Represents elements as a tree structure. Everything in the DOM tree is a node. We have document node, element nodes, character, data, and so forth. And here's the traditional way to manipulate HTML with the DOM. You have something like this P element that has an ID of favorite movie, and this is the inner HTML. Right now it's set to the matrix. You can use JavaScript to select this favorite movie element and then change its inner HTML to The Godfather. And so this is a very simple manipulation of the HTML DOM using JavaScript. Here's another example that uses the query selector all method to locate some elements with the song class inside of an element with the ID favorite songs, and change the inner HTML of the first of those to my new favorite song. When JQuery came along, sometime around, let's say 2005, it sort of simplified the way to do JavaScript manipulation of HTML, gave us some new methods, some new ways of accessing these properties, but it's really doing the exact same thing, selecting elements, making a change. React is totally different. React does something very strange in that it actually treats your entire component as a component, and every change it treats as a complete re-rendering of the component. So here is a React component called favorite songs, which renders this list of songs using this custom data this.props.song. React DOM.render renders this component, and if anytime this data, my new favorite song, there being passed to favorite songs, anytime that changes, it will re-render the entire component. And this would seem to be very inefficient, but because of the way React DOM works, it's actually extremely efficient. This kind of screen update is called declarative screen updates. So whereas JavaScript and jQuery would make changes one at a time, as in this example, declarative programming says, this is what I want it to look like. And then in the case of React, it's React DOM's job to figure out how to make the actual, what's showing the browser, look just like what's actually being rendered by React. And it does this using something called the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM is a simplified representation of the HTML DOM that's kept in memory by React DOM. And React DOM actually keeps two copies of the virtual DOM in its memory at any one time. One represents the ideal state of the application. The other represents the current state of the application. And by state here, we mean what's showing in the DOM. So we have an ideal, which is represented by what React has rendered, the components. And we have the current, which is the previous ideal state before things were changed. React DOM calculates the difference between these two DOMs and creates a patch. And then it applies this patch to the actual DOM. So it's just making the very minimal amount of change to the HTML DOM to update what's in the browser at any one time. And it can apply all kinds of efficiencies and batch the changes and do all kinds of great things to make this very, very efficient. So after the initial load of a React application, subsequent changes and updates to it are very fast. Versus React DOM, the virtual DOM versus the HTML DOM, virtual DOM is local and simplified, and the goal of the virtual DOM is to only re-render when the state changes, so that's when the state object changes. But you as the developer can write code as if the entire tree is being rendered. This makes it very easy to understand. Behind the scenes, React DOM works out the details and creates a patch for the HTML DOM. Let's see, one moment, please. In server-side React, you can actually pre-render your components on the server, and this saves some time with the initial rendering of React. And this also has benefits in that Google will see this initial rendering rather than the JavaScript. And so it makes it easy. It's better for SEO to use server-side React to render the initial state of the application on the server and then serve that to the browser. This is also known as isomorphic React. You may have heard that term. When you're ready to deploy your application, it's important to switch to the production build. The production build is an optimized and compressed version of the React application. The difference here is around 500K, so you definitely want to do it. The development build has all kinds of warnings and tools for working with React that are very helpful in debugging and developing React, but the production build is highly optimized and compressed and is what you should always deploy to the server. So that is my presentation about React. We have, again, some special offers for attendees of this webinar. You'll be getting an email with a reminder about all of these. And if you have questions, you can email Wintellect webinarqa@wintellect.com. And I'm going to quickly here see if there's anything in the questions area. Let's see. We have one here. Can we use React for large-scale applications? Yes, absolutely. React is being used on a lot of very high-traffic websites. And also React Native is being used for very high-traffic mobile apps. Things like Instagram, Facebook, these are using React. Facebook, yes, Facebook created React and uses React extensively. And then let's see other questions here. We have what is the version? I don't know if this is related to Node or React, but React is currently on version 16 point something. Node, the version that I'm using is 10.13. And then it looks like we just have some things about the quick poll. So apologies about the poll. I hope that wasn't too distracting and everyone was able to get the gist of the slides, any slides you missed or anything you missed. Again, you can reach me at Chris Minnick on Twitter or chris@minnick.com. And thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And I hope to talk to you again soon.